Okay, we're live.
Good afternoon and good morning to everyone, depending on where you are attending from today. My name is Amanda Ikanian. I'm currently an assistant professor at the UTA School of Social Work. I'm in my second year. My work centers primarily on homeless service systems and the implementation of programs and policies within those systems. I've also worked closely with the Grand Challenge to End Homelessness on several initiatives over the years, including efforts to integrate homelessness content into social work education. I'll be giving you a brief background for today's webinar and covering some housekeeping before I turn it over to today's moderator and panelists. So first, on behalf of the 13th Grand Challenge of Social Work National Steering Committee, I'm excited to welcome our guests who are joining us via Zoom and YouTube today. Today's webinar is the fourth part of a 7-part series dedicated to the 13th Grand Challenge on eliminating racism. Because this is the newest Grand Challenge with a focus on the urgent crisis of racism in society, the National Webinar Working Group has organized this series to highlight why eliminating racism should be a lens through which we view each of the Grand Challenges. The series launched in June with our esteemed speaker, Dr. Patricia Reed Merritt, who gave us a strong charge to continue the work no matter the challenges ahead. Our second webinar focused on the Grand Challenges to promote smart decarceration and achieve equal opportunity and justice. We were excited to hear from experts in that webinar on the ground in Harris County, Ohio, as they work to eliminate racism in those 2 Grand Challenge areas. The third webinar offered a critical dialogue on actionable policies and practices within agencies designed to reduce economic inequality. Today, we're excited to be leaning into the Grand Challenges of ending homelessness and eradicating social isolation. We hope today that you get a good snapshot of tangible examples of how we can eliminate racism across these 2 areas. As we've asked in previous webinars, let us first commit to listen and to engage with one another today for what we hope will be an instructive session. Before we begin, though, there are a few housekeeping things I just want to cover so everyone has the best experience possible. So first, we are excited to have 2 audiences today, one on Zoom and one on YouTube, so we'll engage them both throughout the webinar. Second, there are some differences in how you can engage depending on which platform you're on. All of our Zoom attendees can communicate and interact in the chat box on Zoom. Zoom attendees won't have the ability to be on camera. Zoom attendees can also enter questions through the Q&A feature on the control bar at the bottom of your screen. Attendees will also have the ability to see questions submitted by other attendees. And if someone has the same or a similar question to you, you can actually upvote that question. And this will allow today's moderator to determine which questions are most popular amongst the audience, because we'll only have about 10 minutes for questions. The Q&A feature is a separate feature from the chat box, so be sure to put questions in the Q&A box that you really want answered. For YouTube attendees, you can enter your questions or thoughts in the comments section below the live video, and we'll monitor those questions as well. Okay, that's enough for housekeeping today. I'm now going to introduce our esteemed panelists, and we'll then pass the baton over to our moderator for today's discussion, Dr. Terrence Fitzgerald, a member of the webinar working group. So our first panelist is Dr. Ben Henwood. Ben is an associate professor at the director of the Center for Homelessness, Housing, and Health Equity Research at the University of Southern California School of Social Work. Dr. Henwood is an expert in health and housing services research, and his work connects clinical interventions with social policy. Specifically, Dr. Henwood's research was among the first to investigate how permanent supportive housing can serve as a health home for homeless individuals with complex health and social needs. His work in supportive housing spans the lifespan, with projects focused on transition-aged youth and older adults. The former was supported by the National Institute of Mental Health, and the latter supported by the National Institute on Aging. He is also a co-author of the book Housing First: Ending Homelessness, Transforming Systems, and Changing Lives, published by the Oxford University Press. And his proposal to end homelessness was adopted by the American Academy of Social Work and Social Welfare as the grand challenge to orient the profession. Dr. Henwood has also served as the methodological lead for the Greater Los Angeles County Homeless Count, which is the largest unsheltered count in the United States. Our second panelist is Antoine Lavelle, who is currently a doctoral candidate at Fordham University's Graduate School of Social Service and earned his MSW from the New York University Silver School of Social Work. His primary interests are housing and homelessness, with an emphasis on inequities embedded within social policies. His work has been published in Urban Social Work and the Journal of Behavioral Health Services and Research. Antoine has spent his career advocating for more effective policies to address homelessness and currently does so as the Chief Operating Officer at Collaborative Support Programs of New Jersey, which is a peer-led, not-for-profit organization that provides flexible, community-based services to promote responsibility, recovery, and wellness through the provision of wellness centers as well as supportive and respite housing. Previously, Antoine worked as the director of supportive housing at the Children's Village, where he oversaw a large division that provided transitional housing for runaway and homeless youth. So now, Dr. Fitzgerald, thank you so much for participating as a moderator today. I'm going to pass the torch on to you, and we look forward to today's discussion.
Thank you. I would first like to thank again both of our participants today and their participation in exposing such an important topic to our audience and really giving a true understanding to this issue around race and homelessness and social isolation. But to get us started, for the audience, could you please, both of you, give us sort of a background in terms of your work and your scholarship?
Sure. Antoine, do you want to go ahead?
Sure, absolutely. I'm really excited to participate on this panel. And I do so as a scholar practitioner, but also someone with lived experience of being homeless. I always say that my work really is driven by my experience of being homeless. I present, as a homeless individual in a peer-led organization, and my work and my scholarship really is based off of that lived experience. Throughout my career, I've worked on behalf of homeless populations, but more so, I've always known that they know more than me. I believe in a paradigm shift of allowing people with lived experience to be at the forefront of what we do in terms of homeless policies. I am very much an expert, but yet someone who understands that things have to change in homeless policies, more so housing policies, and understand that racism and white supremacy is embedded in all of our institutions. And until we acknowledge it, things won't change. And that's who I am, a little bit of who I am, but more so I'm a African-American man who understands that even though I'm educated and I'm allowed to be at the table talking about homelessness, that I still have challenges within these institutions. And I want to make sure that my work goes towards changing these things. It's very important that we as academics, as practitioners, really open the doors for others to actually have these conversations, right? We should allow our experiences and our educations really to open the door for those individuals. And that's a little bit of who I am. And I think through conversation, you'll learn a little bit more of my work, of really my ideas of how to change things, because change has to occur, right? Racism really is the piece that pushes people into poverty. And until we really deal with poverty and inequality, things will not change. And I have to understand and let people know that we too are a part of the problem, because we perpetuate white supremacy and racism. And we'll get to those conversation discussions throughout, this webinar, but I want us to really have a real conversation about this. And for me to be on this webinar is not someone who's going to be light with this topic, because this topic is important to me, right? Because this really impacts who I am in my life. So this is a little who I am, Ben.
Thank you very much for that.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you, Antoine. I really appreciate those comments and feel honored to be on a panel with you talking about this topic. And thank you for the introduction. I think, some of my work was already touched on that really looks at a housing first approach to permanent supportive housing. which I'm guessing many people know, but that's an evidence-based intervention to address chronic homelessness. And I've looked at the implementation of that model and to understand how it works, whether and how it works to improve health outcomes. But I think, for today's topic, a lot of the work since 2015 that has focused on the grand challenge to end homelessness, that I'm now a co-lead with Dr. Deborah Paget, who's at NYU. It has focused, heavily on sort of downstream interventions like Housing First and critical time intervention, sort of community treatment, these things that social work interventions that we know work. But I think we're also looking to how to establish, evidence-informed practices for other understudied populations, including, young adults and whether this model applies to them. I think importantly for today, and Antoine, some of the comments you were making is also how do we as scholars and educators train the next generation of social workers to really appreciate these topics and perhaps, work on them a little bit differently. And I think, probably most germane for today's topic is, as much as those interventions are, focused on downstream, I think we know that we need to look at those upstream factors, especially the wealth and income inequality that are so much tied to structural racism in this country and the impact that that's had really that's resulted in the problem homelessness that we see today. And that's also a topic, I think, there's actually a forthcoming book on the 13th Grand Challenge, and there's a chapter on there on homelessness and racial inequality that Deborah Paget's the lead on. So I just wanted to mention that chapter because I think it's relevant. But thanks, I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. So, if we're going to take that lead, as Antoine talks about this idea of being real, let's be real about the current state of affairs as it relates to social isolation and racism. What is the current state of affairs? Antoine?
Actually, so Dr. Fisher, I'd like to really just talk a little bit about something that Ben said in terms of training in social work, right? I think, social work, the social work curriculum really perpetuates white supremacy. And how do we actually train individuals to eradicate homelessness when they're being trained in white supremacy and to continue along doing the same thing that they've always known to do? So first, if we're going to deal with social isolation and eradicating homelessness, the training that people actually receive, really, we have to really deal with that first. And that's really about the curriculum, how people are taught. They're taught that, the saviors were white and that these saviors are going to go and now save Black and brown people. So how can we create this shift in how people think and also how they react to individuals when their training is really based in white supremacy, right? So being socially isolated is very much a part of what we should be trying to change, but how can we do that when we're being taught one way, right? So that's when you have someone's teaching and they're learning, you really dictate how they will practice as a social worker.
Okay, thank you. Ben? Yeah, I'll just add on that a little bit because I to take up that point. I mean, look, the current state of affairs, I think we talk a lot about it, in terms of statistics and numbers, and we know just when you look at it that the disproportionate impact that homelessness had, in terms of the population. I think Black or African Americans make up, about 13% of the U.S. population, but 40% of our homeless population, right? So there's no getting around those numbers. And I think importantly, we look to homeless services as a way to address this problem. And I think, when you think about how the impact of structural racism, where do we see that? We see it in the population itself, but I think it's important to disentangle when we're talking about whether or not that exists in homeless services themselves versus society, right? And I think that's an important thing to examine too. And there's been some good recent research that's come out. I know that Dr. Cronley has a recent publication that looked at how we prioritize people for housing. And in fact, we see that there are both racial and gender biases in these kind of vulnerability assessments in terms of who gets into housing. And so, that's something that often goes unquestioned. And I think, likewise, the goal of any homeless service system, you would hope or think, is to get people out of homelessness. And even places that, are trying to do that efficiently, I think you also see disparities within those systems. So in Los Angeles, where I work, we actually, there's been some great work by an ad hoc committee on Black people experiencing homelessness that Monica Wagner has led. And one of the things they looked into was housing retention rates. And we see that African Americans have lower housing retention rates once they're placed into housing. And so the question is, why is that, right? So I think in terms of like the state of the affair, sorry to get back to your question, I mean, we could talk a lot about those numbers, but I think we want to both look at society and I think also what we're doing in our systems to either help ameliorate or perpetuate some of those issues.
Okay, if that's the case, then what are we doing in terms of combating these issues? What are we doing, and what should we be doing in addition to? Because Antoine, you talked about the idea of academia and where academia is falling short, and Ben has talked about more of institutional. So what are we doing to combat this, since we have the data, we have this research, we have this understanding of race in 2021, but what in addition should we be doing?
I think what's happening is that people are doing the research, but that research is not going into how we practice as social workers, but also it's not really changing policy. And that's the problem, is that we really operate within silos. And really, that's why I consider myself a scholar practitioner, right? As a COO, I use research, right, to really inform my decisions on behalf of individuals. So how do we make sure that our research is really translatable into policy changes and that people really understand what the research means? And I think that's where we really have to go. We can't just say we're academics and we only stay in academia. How can a CEO of an organization that really serves homeless individuals understand how they should behave and the policies that they should create? And also just something that Ben said that really made me think further is that there are groups about Black people experiencing homelessness that don't really have Black people on those groups. And that's problematic, right? Don't talk about me without me being in the room, right? There really has to be a power-up approach to policymaking, and those in power should be those who are most impacted by homelessness, right? How can you really know about my day-to-day life, right? My experience of being homeless in a group, and you're talking about changes without me not being in there? And that's a problem, right? And that goes back to who's allowed to be an academic, who's known as a scholar in the field, right? No, the ones who are really scholars are people who are currently experiencing homelessness. And they're the ones who should be on these groups, and that's not really happening. And that really goes back to K-12 education. That goes back to incarceration. That goes back to poor health. It really goes back to, once again, the impact of white supremacy on all institutions. And if we're talking about change, we really have to talk about giving people access. So in terms of social isolation, it's people who are mostly impacted by poverty who are isolated, even from those discussions about policies that really can positively impact their lives. And that goes back to social capital. Right? We should give people access, and not just access, it's about the quality of access and services.
Yeah, and if I could just follow up on Antoine's point. I mean, I think it's very true. I mean, speaking as a white male researcher, we see this problem often in the homelessness space, in terms of who's doing the research. And I think that's an issue, that we need to talk more about. I do agree in terms of having people with the lived experience be more involved. And I think for people who are traditionally trained, that can be very difficult. And in our most recent project, that's funded by the Patient-Centered Research Outcomes Institute, that kind of requires that you have what they call patient involvement, but in this case, it's people with the lived experience of homelessness. We do have an advisory board, and I think that's the, in some ways, the least you could do, I think, when you do this work. And even there, we often get caught with kind of wanting to do these elaborate research designs. And I'll just kind of give you an example of, this is a study on COVID preventive behaviors among people getting into supportive housing. And, we're trying to understand that. And so one thing we wanted to understand is social distancing and movement, right? And so we were talking about people are responding through their cell phones to a series of questions. And we thought it'd be a great idea to actually be able to track people's movement to see whether they are staying near their apartment, their social distancing, and, our advice. And they're, from a research standpoint, doing more kind of GIS exploratory work sounded great. I think our advisory group, just said, wait a second, put the brakes on. People already feel like they're being surveilled and tracked, and this isn't something we feel comfortable doing. And so, I think we really had to listen to that perspective and decide that's not something we're going to do. So I think that there are, things we're inclined to do as researchers, but if we don't have different perspectives, we'll just kind of miss out on those things. So I just wanted to kind of bring that up as an example.
Yeah, and even factoring in privilege. If I'm homeless, I may not have a phone, right? Because I can't afford it.
Yeah.
So then we're leaving out a large group of individuals who can't participate, and their voice or voices won't be a part of the findings from that study, right? We have to think about that. And when I think about homelessness, yeah, I was homeless, but I'm so far removed from it. So I always have to go back to people who are currently experiencing it and hear their voices, because it's going to be so different than what I'm thinking. I also have to think about others within the population of homelessness, like trans women of color. Or we have to think about other groups where trans women of color have to deal with racism, sexism, homophobia, poverty, poor health, and how that impacts homelessness. And we're not thinking about those groups because they are not allowed at the table. I would love to see a trans woman of color oversee a homeless organization one day. And this person may not have the education or the experience, but that lived experience is important, where they can have people around them with the other tools that are important to really give them the power that's needed to push these organizations forward, right? Studies are really great. They're important. The research is great. It's important, but it's the after part, right? Policies may come from a really great place, but the implementation is always the problem, right? Who implements the policy, how it's implemented, your perception of those individuals, the paternalistic nature of researchers and social workers, and how we think about homeless populations. They did nothing to be there, right? Unfortunately, we are a part of the problem of why they're there, right? Especially social work. We're poverty pimps. We benefit from individuals being homeless and being homeless, from individuals being incarcerated. We benefit from that. But it's very much about give my people freedom is what I'm trying to do, right? And freedom can come from research, but it's the after part is where we need to get to.
Well, you both talked about this idea of what's happening within the institutions and academia. And Antoine, you brought in this idea, of intersectionality. As we think about intersectionality and we think about what's not being done in terms of training and having those who are affected by homelessness a part or at the table for these solutions, what advice or what direction do you think institutions such as those who are taking in interns and those universities, what should they be doing to make sure that this is happening, that these people are at the table, that this population that's been ignored, LGBT, disabled, around homelessness, are no longer ignored, and they're at the table for these conversations pertaining to solutions?
I think first they have to stop lying to themselves and lying to the public about their actions every day, right? Racism and white supremacy is nothing new. They're just words that we can now say in front of a camera or in front of others, right? It's very much what's built this country, and it's been built on the backs of Black and brown individuals. So this is not new. So first we have to stop lying. and start telling people that most of the decisions that we make, they're pretty much guided by white supremacy. Dr. Joy DeGraw-Leary said that, racism infects and affects everyone. So first we have to stop lying to ourselves, and then we have to get into what Beyonce says, right? Formation, right? And it's about the formation is the important part, right? We have to make sure that we organize well and that we lead from behind if you are of privilege and make those changes. Right? I think about the New York City homeless leadership and just think they mostly do not reflect the population. How can all of the executive directors in New York City that oversee homeless organizations not be Black and brown in the majority minoritized city? I don't understand that, but I do understand it. I think everyone understands it, but they're not doing anything about it because you can't have those conversations. And that's problematic, right? So it's once again giving people access and quality care and access. The solution is not shelter, right? The solution is affordable housing, right? The solution is what Bill Clinton once said, the economy's stupid, right? Labor force participation will dictate a lot of things, your health, your wealth, your access to housing, right? A lot of things, right? Generational wealth. This is what we have to start thinking about. Why is it that, African Americans are maybe the first hired, but also the first fired, right? We're not having those conversations. And the one thing that we're not doing, we're not being courageous and fearless in eradicating homelessness. Right? We sit aside and we may have a conversation and wear a Black Lives Matter t-shirt, but what are you doing about it? Right? How are you operationalizing the principles of Black Lives Matter and giving people access and saying, listen, I may be known as a subject matter expert, but let me bring people to the table who are actually doing the work. So there's so much work to be done, and it's just not one area. But if that is your lane and you're in that lane, you can do a lot of work within that lane.
Thank you. Ben, what do you think about that in terms of what should we be saying or doing for these institutions, and especially, universities like ours, to making sure that these people are at the table when we're doing these trainings, when we're instituting or taking the findings from research and making it applicable? What should be happening now?
Yeah, it's a good question, and one that obviously, in some ways I feel a bit self-conscious even, when we reflect on today's panel. It's like, how do I learn to step back, right? Part of our training is to promote our ideas and our, thoughts. And so how do we step back and make room for others? And I think that's something I know that I struggle with, and I struggled with even in kind of today's presentation. So that's one that I think we need to ask and talk about more. I do agree with Antoine, though, that even in some of the solutions, it is amazing, I think, how white supremacy continues to be part of the solution. And just to give an example, where there's a recent federal ruling by Judge Carter, he's a federal judge who took on homeless services in Los Angeles. And he did quite a good job in a 110-page ruling to talk about sort of historically how we arrived at the state of homelessness in Los Angeles, and how, the government participated in the exclusion of, communities of color from housing. And, I think he traced it quite well historically. Unfortunately, the solution that his judgment was that we need to create shelter for everyone who's on the streets. And, that sort of, in my mind, was not sort of a reciprocal response for kind of the historical issues that he brought up. And now that may be because his hands are tied, I'm not sure, but, I do think it looked more of an act of kind of social control than it did of emancipation, right? So, which I think he was kind of claiming. So I do think it's difficult even in I do think we have to look at our solutions. And again, to Antoine's point, I think, who's at the table to talk about this? And we need to start addressing that.
In both of your opinions, has public policy failed the racially marginalized homeless population? And if so, how?
I mean, absolutely. Public policies are part of the problems. I mean, you can go back to the Social Security Act, where African Americans were left out of the benefits from Social Security. And that's problematic when you look at generational wealth, and that impacts homelessness. You can look at the Fair Housing Act and redlining and poor health in minoritized communities. You can look at punitive policies like the man in the house rule, and even current child support policies that push people into jails and prisons. And just to think about a statistic is that more than 50% of those leaving incarceration in New York go to shelter. And 90% of those shelter residents are Black and brown by design. And that's because of policies or haphazard policies.
Yeah, I was just kind of echo to your question. I don't know that public policy has failed. I think it's been quite successful in what it set out to do. I mean, these were intentional policies of exclusion. I mean, maybe the end goal was not to have the kind of homelessness problem that we have today, but it definitely was, exclusion of generational wealth, like Antoine said. So in some ways, I do think, public policy sort of reflects and got us to where we are today. And I think the question is like, right? So then if it can do that, then what are some corrective policies that can be put in place? And I think there are some, and we're starting to see them, but it's sort of getting the support to pass those policies. And we can talk about that, but just in terms of answering your question, I just want to reflect the intentionality, I think, that was there all along.
Well, if that's the case, then what is getting in the way then? Since we know public policy has taken us to where we are today, we wouldn't have the benefits that we have and the aid, or at least the governmental focus. What are some of the barriers that are stopping us from truly approaching this issue and eradicating this concern? What is getting in our way?
I honestly believe that policymakers don't really understand the population. And I would say what's getting in the way is capitalism and neoliberalism, right? That's a longer discussion. And really just looking at the shelter population and providers in New York City, it's capitalism, right? People are making a lot of money off of shelter residents instead of really dealing with the problem, right? Because, Medicaid pays for, shelter residents in New York City, right? So nobody really cares, right? It's not my money, it's federal dollars that's trickling down to New York City, so no one's doing it. So let's spread the wealth across the board. And that's a problem where we can just pay for vouchers, or even those apartments, those tier 2 family shelter apartments in New York City, we can now make those apartments that are supported by vouchers. But we're not doing that because that would solve the problem, right? So capitalism is a problem. I think we're complicit observers of the issue rather than dealing with it. So we can actually deal with the problem, but we're not.
Yeah, I might just add to it might be a different way of saying some of what Anton was talking about, which is that I think especially in homelessness, we often study down to the problem, right? So we study people experiencing homelessness and who they are and where they come from and what they do, right? And there's a much more limited research in terms of, well, what impact does, Amazon coming and expanding their operations in Seattle? I don't know because the research hasn't been done, but what research there is sort of suggests that some of that income inequality that we see from those high paying jobs definitely contributes to rates of homelessness locally. So we know that, right? But there's a long, line or thread between those two that we don't look at. And I think that's true of reporting as well. I think often reporters look at the problem, right? But they don't often look at the decision making that goes on, right? And other players that should be at the table. And I do think it involves corporations and the economy, obviously, but how we factor that into our discussion, our research, I don't think often is well thought through.
Yeah, and I also think it goes back to the perception of poverty. Even when you look at housing vouchers and work requirements, it doesn't really factor in structural racism. That people may look for employment, but they may not be able to find it. And if they do, it may not be quality employment, and they may not be paid the same amount as their white counterparts. Even when we look at public housing, there are work requirements, but no one's saying that, within public housing, most of the residents are older adults and people with disabilities, but yet we still put work requirements there, right? If I can work, I would, but what are the barriers that are there that limit my participation in the labor force? We're not talking about those things. The perception is that people do not work because they are lazy. It goes back to even with COVID and the narrative that people do not want jobs that are open. It is not that. It is that people are not paid a fair wage. And we have to go back to really with the narrative, the truth. It goes back to what I said earlier, is that we have to start telling the truth and stop lying. It is not individuals, it is systems. And when you see symptoms, it's really that these systems are not working on behalf of the people that they should be serving.
How do we keep that truth, as you call it, that truth about race, the truth about systemic oppression and marginalization? How do we keep that truth at the forefront as we push forward? Because it seems as if over time, the subject matter sort of begins to become diluted, and then we overlook, and then we're dealing with the same issue again and again, and then someone brings it up, and then it becomes diluted. How do we keep each other responsible? How do we keep academia responsible, institutions and organizations who are doing this work, to making sure that this conversation, your truth, is being put forth as we make advances?
Yeah, so Terrence, it's really it's not my truth, it's everyone's truth, right? Because racism and white supremacy affects, it affects everyone, right? Even for somebody who is a capitalist, it's going to impact your bottom line. So really, it's a global issue. So it's really, how do we? I wish I had the answer to that. I really don't know. I think it takes community. I think it takes people being fearless rather than fearful of having these conversations, and even in academia, who's tenured and who's not, right? And I think individuals will say, well, people are more fearless once they get tenure. No, they're not. No, they're not. They perpetuate white supremacy even when they're tenured, right? So when you see African-American women not being tenured, that's a problem, right? When you see, African-American men not being, hired for certain roles, but they're adjuncts, that's a problem, right? And these things happen. And when we keep seeing these things happen, we clutch our pearls and say, oh my goodness, I didn't know. Of course you did. You see every day is that you are not fearless. So we have to continue being fearless and not be fearful.
What do you think, Ben?
Well, I mean, I agree. I think some of it, in all of the grand challenges, we were asked to come up with, right, to the extent that these are researchable issues and you want to monitor progress, you were required to say, how are you going to measure the success or failure, of whether this problem is being addressed? And, I think that's all these questions, if we keep at the forefront, well, what are the numbers, right? Like how many African-American women got tenured this past year? If those are numbers that we look at, then it'll be a lot harder to go back to the conversation, right, of carrying on with business as usual. So, I mean, I think that's part of it. I think articulating, what some of those measurable outcomes is, now sounding much like a researcher here, in addition to, I think, the courageous conversations that Antoine was talking about.
Okay, I guess my last question, as we think about, I think we talked about it and brushed on it, but I think we've seen the importance of grassroots organizations, people who are on the ground working. But we've also seen that they have very little influence in shaping public policy in relations to research, researchers at universities. How do we make sure that these individuals, these people who are doing this work, are at the table as researchers are pushing and leading public policy? How do we make sure that their voices are heard? Anyone?
So I'll use myself as an example. So as a practitioner, I purposely applied for a PhD program so that I could start to understand research and also do research on my own, so that when I became a practitioner again, I will be able to use that research and also be at the table with academics, because academia is very elitist, right? If you don't have those letters behind your name, no one's listening to you, right? So it's best to have the letters behind your name and have that legitimacy as a practitioner, so that now you can be in the room and make sure that that research is now being transferred over to practice. So I think the best way to do it is to ensure that individuals with PhDs, who are also academics, are in the room when those conversations are being had. And there are a lot of scholar practitioners out there. And I think, unfortunately, if you're not a tenure track professor or if you're not a part of a department, people don't want to listen. But there are other ways of solving the problems in homelessness, right? We have to be in all spaces and all places to get this done. The solution doesn't only lie in academia. It's everywhere, right? It's in academia, it's in organizations, it's in all places and all spaces, and we have to go and find those solutions in those spaces. And this goes back to like diversity, inclusion, and equity, right? If you don't go out and find these individuals, then you can say, well, I don't know what's going on. That's the easy way to do it. But you have to go out and do the legwork, right? Because it's not going to be in a conference room at your university. It's everywhere, right? It's in homeless shelters, right? It's in organizations, right? It's in just people who have had lived experience and have moved on. It's more than that. And when you talk about homelessness, it is about justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. We have to include everyone, right? And it can't be just at a panel, right? It can't be on this, committee. No. If we're going to address homelessness, it has to really be about inclusion and not just academics.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Terrence, just maybe to add a little bit. I mean, I think that there's some grassroots organizations I think that have had a big impact. A lot have not, and feel excluded from the discussion. I think some of this also goes back to philanthropy and how money gets allocated. So I don't think we can leave that out of the discussion. But also I think, to Antoine's point, we don't have great models in academia for sort of the practitioner research, like they do in sort of medicine, where you might practice
right.
And teach, right? And I think there's a loss in that, and so we could have more of that. So I guess I can't really speak for grassroots organizations, not being part of one now, but I do think, at least on the research side, I think we've talked about this a lot in terms of, dissemination, right? How do we get our findings out there? And that's usually something we talk about like after the fact, when research is done. And in some ways there's a question that, well, if you don't already know how you're going to have impact, then, maybe you shouldn't be doing the research to begin with. I think, I don't know if that's true or not, but I think it's a legitimate question. And so I think more of the conversation with policymakers in terms of what would move the needle for them in terms of designing research is probably an important conversation to have, and that we could learn to engage better in.
Thank you very much for this intriguing conversation. Thank you both for your participation. I'm sure you have enriched all of us with your knowledge. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we'll have a concluding thoughts.
I'm trying to think.
Or questions, I should say.
Yeah, if there were
any big questions.
Did we get the question from Richard Barth? Did we ask that one? You see that one in the chat?
Yes. Oh, well, here we go. One of you would mind answering this, one of the audience members asked, how can we better operationalize Black Lives Matter in homelessness policy, programs, and practices? Are there adaptations we need to make to eliminate the impact of white supremacy in homelessness prevention or services?
Wow, great question. It's really about like equity, inclusion, diversity, and justice is the way to do so. And that's really, I think we've had the discussion about that, of allowing people with lived experiences into the room, those who have gone through poverty, who are currently impoverished, those who have survived it. That's the way to do it, right? It's changing policies and really, I firmly believe that it should be from a power-up approach to policymaking. That's really how you infuse Black Lives Matter into this challenge of eradicating homelessness.
Yeah, and I do think it's a difficult question, and not that I have a direct answer, but there are a lot of policies now. Maxine Waters has proposed a lot of policies that could be passed through the Budget Reconciliation Act that would make housing vouchers entitlements, expand affordable housing, and promote home ownership. But one of the questions, and we saw this with sort of the eviction prevention money, is that even if those things get passed, they still have to be dispersed, right? And that all that happens at a local level. And so we know that most of the money that was allocated to help people, avoid eviction has just been sitting there, and not used, right? And so, I think we definitely need to look at policies because we need those. And then the implementation of those policies are really important. Otherwise, they're not going to get to the people who need them the most.
Yeah, and Terrence, just to follow up with that, we know that poverty and deep poverty are strong predictors of homelessness, and we have to look at those areas like healthcare, labor market participation, and targeted incarceration to start to deal with homelessness, right? And those are just structural changes, and that's really about Black Lives Matter. But we know that African Americans and Latinos are disproportionately impacted by those areas. Right? That's how you really start to deal with homelessness. In New York City, family shelters are the head of the household are African American women. So thinking about it through an intersectional lens of racism and sexism and its impact on homelessness.
Hey, Terrence, I think I have to just really jump in here and kind of like actually emphasize something that we also miss oftentimes in academia, and understanding how some of those movements work and where the money goes when you're just pumping out your donations and clicking on a hashtag. So many times I get calls while I'm in New Jersey doing organizing work on the ground from a university, from wherever, asking me to assist them with a local problem. And I ask them, have you asked X, Y, and Z who's working outside of your campus gates, who you don't engage with because you're not connected with them, and they have no clue who that organization is. And this is not to beat up BLM or the Movement for Black Lives or headquarters or all the different groups that's associated with that movement. But what I will say is that no matter what is occurring, the way that these social ills actually, have far-reaching effects in our community, the most important thing is to know what people are on the ground organizing in those communities. Because you hear BLM, you donate your thousands of dollars to them, but it changes nothing in your locality if you don't understand that you have a decentralized organizing movement that's working right outside of your gates. And it may make more sense if you want to see impact and change from your university to actually pay those smaller grassroots organizations who don't have the funding infrastructure to even qualify for the things that you're putting out, because everyone overlooks them and they're actually the ones doing the work on the ground out of their pocket. Sorry. Actually, no, I'm not sorry. That needed to be said. And
no, don't be sorry. Yeah.
So let me correct
no,
that. I'm
thank
not
you.
sorry at all.
Right. Thank you. No, thank you for speaking up. Is there anything else before we move on to concluding thoughts?
Yeah, I think we addressed this a bit. The question says, Mr. Lavelle discussed how research needs to be accessible so that the people that it's affecting can understand and digest it. How does one balance this accessibility while also keeping the legitimacy and respect from the academic world so that their work is seen? So I think briefly, you guys talked about making the research translatable, but I don't know if anybody had a comment about that, right? So the academic standards, making it accessible to folks that actually are on the ground. And that was, I think, the last question from the audience.
Yeah, I would say, peer-reviewed articles aren't accessible, but there are other types of knowledge, right? We have to understand that just because something is published, right, in a journal article doesn't mean it's good knowledge, right? It just means it's knowledge that's been accepted, right? The voices of those that we serve, that's the best knowledge to listen to. And people aren't voiceless, right? You just have to listen to them so you can hear them, right? That's knowledge as well. It's what we prioritize and what we uplift as being knowledge. And I'll say this, I don't need academics to hear me, right? You will see me in the work that I do every day on behalf of the people that I serve, right? I don't need to be validated by an elitist institution. I'm okay, right? I'm fine. I would say that, Shirley Lavelle raised a pretty strong person, and I don't need to be validated by a white supremacist institution. They all are, right? Right. I just need to be able to be on the ground and really wash the feet of the people that I serve. I'm okay.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, let's move to concluding thoughts and discussion of our next webinar.
Sure, so I can do the wrap up. Jindal, do you want to say anything about the next webinar before I do the sort of final wrap up?
I think you may be mentioning something about the next one in there. So if not, I'll chime in.
All right, I just want to make sure. So as always, I'm always impressed to hear Ben and Antoine talk about their work and their leadership in these areas and these two critical grand challenges. This is a really interesting conversation and discussion to listen to. I want to thank our panelists and everyone attending on Zoom and YouTube. A special thank you also to the UTA School of Social Work for hosting this webinar series, the grand challenges of social work for their leadership and support, and everyone on the National Webinar Committee for making this event happen. We hope to see many of you at the October 12th webinar, which focuses on creating social responses for changing environment and harnessing technology for social good. There are also webinars throughout the month of December, and with this sort of ongoing series and lively conversations that we've had, we hope you all come back to join future webinars. Have a great day.
Thank you.